Veils of Oblivion. Having barely survived a hair-raising archaeological dig in Tikal, Guatemala, Indiana Jones has returned to New York just in time to get caught up in a controversy. The mysterious writings of Colonel Percy Fawcett, a missing British explorer, have turned up, and what they describe could revolutionize history and make or break several scientific reputations. For Percy paints a tantalizing picture of a lost city in the Brazilian jungle and a mythical red-headed race who may be the descendants of ancient Celtic druids. No one loves mystery or adventure more than Indiana Jones. So with his trusty bullwhip in hand and the lovely Deirdre Campbell firmly in tow, he sets out for the wilds of the Amazon. But Indy has more enemies than he knows, including a bunch of hard-nosed thugs and a cannibalistic Indian tribe who are out to make him instant history. And if he survives what they throw his way, there's still the fabled city itself, where the inhabitants practice the magic of the Seven Veils, and no one leaves alive. Indy's a prisoner of a tribe who can control his mind. Indiana Jones and the Seven Veils.
Hello and welcome back to this damn Fully-Dillistic Crusade. This video is a review of the third Bantam Indiana Jones novel, Indiana Jones and the Seven Veils, written again by Rob MacGregor, and this being the third book in the series also sort of finishes off what I like to think of as a sort of opening trilogy to these novels. All three of these books were written and actually published in the same year of 1991, and they do reference events and some characters return from the first two books, so I think this is really the third of a sort of ending trilogy, and what this book does for Indy's character, and not only moving him closer to the Indy of the films, because these novels are prequels set in the 20s, it also has several significant events that do fundamentally alter his character, and it really rounds off things that were started in Peril at Delphi. So I think it's good to read these books in close proximity and read them in chronological order. This one also builds on what happens in the first two books, and while I think it has some of the same issues that I think you'll run into in the first two books, I really think it manages to gel a lot more overall. So for me, finally reading these in chronological order and seeing how they sort of build in the first three books, I think you can definitely tell a sort of progression and a sense of, okay, here the author is starting to find their stride a little bit more, because you get that in Dance of the Giants, where the second half does feel more like an Indiana Jones film, but the whole first half of the book does feel like a little bit of a slog to get to the more action-packed second half. Well, here the action starts right in the opening and continues throughout. So of the three, this one, it has all the stuff you're looking for, much more, in terms of an Indiana Jones feeling experience, and this one really is a pulp adventure. This one, you could picture it as being a novel from decades past, not even featuring Indiana Jones, and it would feel right at home in terms of it. It has some elements of Doc Savage, some elements of Tarzan in places. You know, it has all the pulpy requirements. Like the first two books, it does open with essentially an action beat, but here it's actually a setup sequence, and it's at an archaeological dig where hijinks occur, and essentially they're stalked by a bunch of treasure hunters, and Indy's having to deal with a rather snarky and snooty professor colleague of Marcus Brody's, or I should say more of a antagonist and rival of Brody's, who is leading the archaeological dig. But Indy is also there with the lovely Deirdre Campbell, who was the love interest introduced in Dance of the Giants, and by the end of that book, the relationship between her and Indy had developed into something potentially rather serious, which even led Indiana Jones to propose marriage at one point in Dance of the Giants, which felt a little bit out of character, and because the character of Deirdre was only developed in certain ways, it felt a little sudden in that book. Well, I don't really think it's a spoiler in this book because it does happen pretty soon in terms of the where it comes in the actual story and the page count, and it's a very notable and debated topic amongst indie fans. In this book, they actually do get married, and Deirdre follows Indy on his quest, which is actually revolving around the interesting usage of the real life Colonel Fawcett and his search for the lost city of Z and his disappearance. The main thrust of the plot gets set up when Marcus Brody receives actual pages from Fawcett's journal and basically asks Indy to go try and find Fawcett, who was apparently an old friend of Brody's. I love how MacGregor uses real life history and events and things to tie into the stories and also gives you the proper background. So he makes all of the real world parallels that he's using actually fit within the story he's telling. But in the first two books, it kind of frequently would just stop and give you almost a mini history lesson about druids or the Oracle at Delphi and things like that. Whereas here, it's better woven into the plot. And I love the setup idea of Indiana Jones trying to find the lost Colonel Fawcett and perhaps also in the process find the mythical lost city of Z somewhere in the jungles of South America. So it's a great setup, and it's nice that Indy has someone to bounce off of because Deirdre is in tow the whole time, and they actually get married on the ship that takes them there. There is at least some building on where their relationship had gone and how things had kind of soured after Dance of the Giants, and essentially they decide to just get married anyway. And this was the only novel I had growing up of the series because they were unfortunately out of print and tough to find. So imagine my surprise as a kid starting this book, and rather quickly, Indy suddenly gets married to a character I'd never heard of before. And I'm just like, what is going on here? Why have I never heard of this before? So this whole notion is still very much debated in and amongst Indiana Jones fans who have actually read all the various novels, or at least the Bantam series. It's still, definitely a bit sudden, even though if you're reading these in order, you're introduced to the character in A Dance of the Giants, but there's still not a whole lot to go off of here in terms of really making this relationship believable. It's certainly well written, and once the adventure is underway, I love the fact that they actually banter back and forth, and Deirdre is sort of a participant in all the action to varying degrees, so she does seem to play more of an active role than she did in Dance of the Giants, because she wasn't in all of Dance of the Giants. She would kind of appear sporadically and then got captured at the end and had to be rescued. So I like the fact that she is maintained throughout the book as Indy's sidekick, essentially. And the action does start at the opening, and we have continual action beats as the story progresses. And the pacing is much improved over the previous two books. Unfortunately, I do feel the plotting and the writing is still a little bit... I hate to say clunky, but you do still have some degree of what I found in the first two books of there are points where you're kind of scratching your head a little bit to figure out where exactly the plot is going. But because the pace is increased over the previous two books and we don't have to wait a significant amount of time to actually get to exciting action beats that also move the plot forward a little bit, I think this is a more consistently engaging read over the previous two books. And while the whole notion of Indy getting married as a younger man in the 1920s does seem a bit odd, since we've never heard of this outside of these particular books, it is something different. So it will throw you a little bit at first, without question, if you're an Indy fan and you just know the films and you're reading these books for the first time. But because it's something a little bit different, and this is still Indy before Temple of Doom, if you're following the chronology of the character, this is something we haven't seen before. So that does at least pique your interest, even if it may seem weird to you. Some people love the idea of it being something different and Indy being married as a younger man. Some fans hate it. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, but in this book, I do think it actually manages to work throughout the main sort of thrust of the plot. So essentially, the book opens with the archaeological dig sequence, which does have Indy and some others get stuck inside of a temple, which does at least start with an Indy bit of flavor. They have to make their way out, and then they're assaulted by and menaced by treasure seekers. And then after that sort of opening sequence, we get to New York. We get to see Marcus Brody actually in his prime, which does, again, have a nice sort of direct connection to the films, and it's nice to get to see Brody doing something other than being comic relief in terms of how he is depicted in Last Crusade. And then we get the sort of picking up of the Indy and Deirdre relationship from the previous book, and they board the ocean liner to take them to Rio de Janeiro and pick up the trail of Colonel Fawcett. Once they get to Rio, they're actually married on board ship, but they find they're being stalked and menaced by a particular bunch of thugs who they don't even know why they're being followed and attacked. And this leads to a actually rather nice action sequence that takes place at nighttime in the middle of Carnival in Rio, and climaxes on Sugarloaf Mountain with the cable cars. And so, being a Bond fan, I can't help but think this whole bit was probably inspired, at least somewhat, by all the Rio sequences in Moonraker. However, it does do something of its own. It's not just taking that, a part and parcel like most modern films would do when they're inspired by something. They just merely regurgitate it. But I just thought it was a nice sort of interesting bit that did make me think of Moonraker the film, because you even have Indy getting out of the cable car and going around. He has this rather silly idea that he's going to climb up the rest of the way by hand on the actual cables, which he finds out very quickly is a bad idea. So you do see Indy make mistakes. He is a bit more foolhardy in places because he hasn't lived through all the experiences before we see him in Raiders and Temple of Doom. But after the Rio sequence, in terms of the action, we then move to various other locales, and we start getting introduced to more of the mystical aspects or the elements that are more in the realm of fantasy and the supernatural, which you always need at least some dose of that in an Indiana Jones story. The trouble is how to balance it and not overdo it and ruin the realism to ground the story. This also kind of highlights, I think, one of the book's issues, that the actual villain of the piece and what the villain is after is not ever expressly stated until we get more towards the end section. And there's actually several villains, and their motivations are just kind of tossed aside, and it's actually very hard to determine and classify who exactly is the primary villain, because you technically have two with a bunch of sub-villains and henchmen, and then other side characters tied to them, and it's essentially two different camps of villainy in this story, and you only get the full scope of what their actual plans are. It's sort of just tossed off. It kind of crammed in at the ending section. The whole final act of this book kind of takes a left turn, and I mean that they literally do, go to a specific locale. So it's like all of a sudden they're in a completely different book in terms of the setting. Indy and Deirdre wind up witnessing a lot of very interesting elements, and in the process also wind up getting more pages of Fawcett's journal. And so we have sort of peppered throughout the book all of these journal entries that are dated, and it's as Fawcett was getting deeper and deeper into the jungle and encountering strange things and people and visions, and his party was essentially breaking up and would be essentially start dying off one at a time, until eventually he was on his own and sort of questioning his own sanity at that point. So it does serve to give you more of the sense of the mystery of that's trying to be unraveled, and it's nicely sort of peppered throughout as Indy and Deirdre get these other pages and read them, and each one of the sort of unlocks a little bit more of the mystery they're trying to solve. There's also a really interesting sequence about in the middle of the book where they actually are told more information by they're actually at a sort of tribal seance that they witness. The so-called fortune teller, which Indy of course doesn't buy any of this, be seemingly possessed by a spirit that actually tells them more about Colonel Fawcett and why they themselves are there. And of course they see things that and phenomena they cannot explain during this seance, and it's really described in detail, so it very much puts you right there in the moment. And Indy seeing some sort of tribal ritual / possession, with the person clearly demonstrating that something is going on here by, injuring themselves somehow, and then once the possession is over, their body is unmarked by those hot coals or irons or things, and it does feel at least like a scene you'd expect to see in an Indiana Jones movie. So while this is where we start to get more directly into the elements of fantasy, it doesn't feel completely removed. So I think the book and its plot does work really well, even though I do wish it was a bit less convoluted and confusing in places to try and follow the narrative trail. It's when we get to the final section, when Indy and Deirdre and their party essentially board a plane to go deeper into the jungle to find the point at which they know Colonel Fawcett was at last, and essentially where their pages of the journal end. When they do this, they wind up suddenly running into the one contingent of villains and the henchmen that have been dogging them and trailing them and trying to kill them the whole time, essentially to keep them from supposedly finding what happened to Fawcett and maybe finding the lost city he was searching for. Well, when they encounter them, there's a nice action sequence aboard the plane, and then they find themselves deep in the jungle at the point where Colonel Fawcett last was, and they actually do wind up encountering various tribes, including a rather nasty tribe of cannibals, because of course you have to have a nasty cannibalistic tribe that just wants to kill you for whatever reason in any good pulp adventure story set in the jungle. But this does actually wind up pushing them further into the jungle, where they do actually find the lost city, which is, of course, very much different to what Colonel Fawcett thought he was looking for, which is a nice sort of twist on things. This is where the book does basically turn into something else entirely. It does make sense with all of the journal pages and the setup we've had for it. We've been kind of primed by the other sort of villain contingent or mysterious characters that started popping up in the book about at the halfway point, because they seem to have these mysterious abilities, including the ability to essentially make themselves invisible. This is referred to as veiling and is part of the 7 veils of the title. Now, the sort of lost city is set up to be the relative descendants of Celtic druids who migrated to this area many, many centuries beforehand. And they've managed to survive all of these years by essentially being undiscovered. So you have a sort of, essentially it's a sort of Lost Horizon, Shangri-La, hidden city type deal, where there is a certain element of magic or fantasy, because these people have developed these certain abilities that also help to keep them masked or veiled away from the outside world. And the 7 veils of the title refer to the 7 different levels of veiling that also forms the sort of backbone of their society and culture. It's a fascinating setup and idea, and it's interesting to see the sort of city and culture that MacGregor comes up with here, because it's also relatively based on I really like a lot of telekinesis. They essentially blur the lines between the dream state and actual life itself when you're awake. So Indy and Deirdre and some of these other characters are sort of thrust into this strange world where outside of it, there's all kinds of hostile tribes. So essentially, they're kind of between a rock and a hard place, and you find out that essentially they were not meant to discover this city, and then it's how are they going to get out of this situation? Now, this is all the same sort of setup that you're given by the sort of blurb on the back. And if you know they're searching for perhaps a lost city, if they do find it, it's probably going to get a bit hairy for them. They're going to try to quickly find a way out of it. So this is all still very much grounded in a classic sort of pulp adventure story. None of it is surprising, and I try to always avoid any potential spoilers in these book reviews I do. So I'm just giving you the basic idea of the plot. But unfortunately, because all of the stuff with the Lost City and this culture and the idea of veiling and all the stuff that MacGregor does with the dream state and how Indy and Deirdre have to then interact and figure out what the heck is literally going on, it's all crammed in at the end, so it does feel a bit confusing, and honestly, it's a little bit rushed, because not only do we have to get introduced to all these concepts all of a sudden, introduced to this culture in the city, and Indy and Deirdre's plight, what happened to Colonel Fawcett, and then how in the heck are they going to get out of this, and what does this do to their characters emotionally and psychologically, and what are the perils they are faced with being stuck in this place, and what will these people want to do with them, or will they just want to kill them? And then they have to attempt an escape, which does go through multiple action beats as part of the sequence, and then we have the final denouement, and then there's also a short epilogue as well, and we're already starting to reach the end of the book by the time the Lost City is even approached. It really, I think, required more pages to be able to discuss this stuff in detail and not make it feel quite as rushed as it is. So that also makes it a bit more confusing, because nothing else in the book has anything to do with this lost city, and we've spent the majority of the book on the adventure to get to this point that I really think it needed to at least start a bit sooner. So maybe some of the action beats and set pieces of maybe the second half could have been dropped or cut down a little bit to spend some more time in the Lost City, or maybe just make the Lost City sequence more of the book, because there's so much stuff to describe with the ability to live in the dream state, and how this is even done in the text, and how it jumps back and forth between the waking state and the dream state is a bit jarring, and you have to get used to it, and it's all crammed in here at the end. So this is very much a different sort of book in its ending, and I think this is what throws most people who don't have a fond opinion after reading Seven Veils. And if that were not sort of perplexing and jarring enough, once they actually make their escape attempt, then all of a sudden we reach a point where they manage to get to a particular moment, and then suddenly we go into a completely different feeling segment that definitely links us firmly back to the previous two books, because there is a particular character who makes a return appearance. And I think this was also part of dealing with the city being essentially full of descendants of Celtic druids. This is directly linking us back to the events of Dance of the Giants and the druids there at Stonehenge. And while I get that idea, and I don't mind that connection, that actually makes sense, at the very end of this book, Indy suddenly essentially having a vision and re-encountering a particular character yet again just felt like a bit much. And then the actual ending for our characters is just extraordinarily rushed and definitely pulls the rug out from under you, and is actually quite upsetting because of its, I mean, it feels quite random, actually, and is definitely the major aspect of this book that I am not a fan of. And especially when I first read this as a kid growing up, and this was the only Indy book I had, and I was so shocked by the fact that Indy gets married at the start of the book, that I mean, getting to this point at the ending, definitely it feels like you're having the rug pulled out from under you, and it's just so sudden, and the book just suddenly stops right there, and it's just sort of kind of the feeling of like, oh yeah, that happened, but you know, you're in a vision right now, so yeah, you're gonna wake up and everything's gonna be fine. And then we at the very least, the book doesn't end right there at that, because had it ended there, it would have been a really terrible ending. But we do have a little epilogue that, I mean, again, kind of has the feeling of Lost Horizon when you think of the lead character being back in the outside world and kind of coming to after a recovery period and just rambling about all these things that he had seen, and everybody kind of thinks he's crazy. But there's the nice touch of Indy can't quite remember everything he had seen, because the inhabitants of the Lost City do have the ability to play with people's memory. But again, the ending still, even though you get the little epilogue with Indy and Brody, it's the ending of this book is the single worst element. I do already think that the whole sort of final act in the Lost City is very much a left turn. I mean, you're at least led to expect that we're going to get something at the end, perhaps in a Lost City or dig site or something. You're going to see something more in the supernatural, odd category that you expect in an Indy story. But it's so much to take in all at once without a lot of pages left that it just feels just like all of a sudden you're in a completely different book and you don't quite know what's going on, and suddenly we're at the end, and then they make their dash for escape, and then there's just a point where the book just literally, just hard stop, and you're like, wait, what just happened? Plus Indy has a weird vision again, and you're like, wait, what am I reading here? So unfortunately, I think the ending does actually mar the overall feeling you get when you read this particular book. But I still think it is, of the three, it is the best of the first three books. It is the pulpiest for sure. It is the most consistently engaging because the action beats and the adventure starts right at the opening sort of prologue sequence. Overall, I just wish that the actual legitimate villain of the piece was more clearly defined, his goals were more clearly defined, and that they were firmly established at a point and then built upon, because when you really examine it, you've got two different factions of villainy that have different goals, and it's never really fleshed out. And I mean, for most of the book, Indy and Deirdre are being menaced by thugs, and they don't even know exactly why, other than they don't want them to get to the Lost City or Colonel Fawcett, or find out anything. So it also doesn't help when you don't exactly know what either villain's goals are, and actually you don't even know who the villain is for most of the book, and then you think you do, but then you find out there's another faction of villainy that has different goals, but that other faction you don't know is actually a villain until the very end of the book, at the very end of the Lost City sequence, and that just seems kind of sudden. And I think that's probably the book's overall issue, is that there's so many sudden bits of development and so many sudden left turns or abrupt turns where you're suddenly like, oh, we're going this way now, that it is a little jarring. And some people love this book, some people hate this book if you read reviews or talk to other indie fans. But for me personally, I think overall this one does at least have more of that wonderful pulp adventure flavor to it, and I think is the most consistently enjoyable of the first three books. And I do like the Indy and Deirdre relationship that is established and then carried throughout this adventure, and how they have their ups and downs, and plus they're newlyweds at the same time, that they just kind of did on the spur of the moment. I like that because it is something different. So I'm just really not a fan of how this book ends, because it's so abrupt and jarring, and just it really does leave a bad taste in the mouth for me. And that's even more than the abrupt sort of everything about the Lost City crammed in the last act, and it's too much to process. Like that's its own problem. I think the even bigger problem is just the abrupt suddenness of the actual ending does even more than the final sequence being too compressed, does sort of make you wonder why you read this again, which is a shame because the rest of the book is really fun and engaging, and I like a lot of the things MacGregor is doing here, and it is a clear growth over the first two books, and because they all were published in the same year and they were all the start of this series, this prequel Indiana Jones series, I do think this is the end of the sort of initial trilogy to set up these. And from this point, MacGregor would write the next couple of novels, and they will have some mentions, as far as I'm aware, to events and characters of the previous three, but they do essentially, with the fourth book, it kind of branches off and starts a new path. So really, it's these first three books that are closely tied together, and if you're going to read these, you should read them in chronological order. Now here is the original Bantam Falcon printing with the beautiful Drew Struzan artwork. I think this is one of his best covers for the series. He always did beautiful paintings for these, but this also has a nice little wraparound effect in terms of you actually get a little bit more art. You have a leopard perched on a tree there. I love the sort of lived-in feeling he's got for Harrison Ford there, with Indy actually being all sweaty and his hat kind of pushed back. Then we've got an image taken or inspired by Temple of Doom from the bridge scene, and even Deirdre has made it onto the cover, and he's given it this sort of with the image, with the sort of square behind her, it looks like an old photograph in a scrapbook tucked in there, and I really love that touch. And then we even have the face of the idol mask that's from, I believe that's from the opening sequence there. So I just love everything that's going on here. There's so many different elements and things that I do think it is. I think it's one of the best covers of the series. And because this is a first printing, all of this is actually embossed. So if you can actually see the Indy logo, the title, and even the mask is nicely embossed. So that's just a nice touch that you find on the first printings. And like I've noticed before on some of these, the actual tagline actually just refers to Indy. So of course, it actually says Indy instead of Indiana Jones, which some of the later printings of various novels actually changed those. So they say Indiana Jones instead of Indy. And I like the usage of Indy here because it actually fits with him being younger and this being a prequel, and it just has more of the young man flavor to it, I guess. I don't know. That's just what it seems like to me. Now, this being a first printing, like my other two of the previous two books, there is a little bit of page tanning, so this is to be expected with all of these by this time, but it does fit it being a 1920s Indiana Jones prequel, so the fact that the pages are a little browned, and especially because you've got all of the journal entries that you get to in the book, it does give it that nice sort of aged artifact feeling. And if that were not enough, you do have the nice vintage ads in the back. So you've got the ads for the other Indy novels so far. You've got the vintage ad for the Lucasfilm Fan Club with the Indy photo. And then even a plug for the Rocketeer novelization that I've been meaning to get. So I need to finally get a copy of that because I'm dying to read it. And then once again, most fittingly, with the author photo, we have an ad for the new Doc Savage novels. And that is perfect for this book because this has elements of Doc Savage in it, far more than the previous two books. The previous two books do have some pulpy bits and aspects to them, but this is the one that will make pulp fans much happier. This is where you really start to get more of the pulp adventure flavor because it is established early on and maintained throughout the book. And then you get to the ending sequence where we go into super wild territory. So you're not going to be bored by the wildness here, even if it might get too crazy or weird for you at the end. At least it's something different and something that's very, very pulpy. So to summarize, in Indiana Jones and the Seven Veils, you have another beautiful Drew Struzan cover. You have Indy getting married to the heroine of the previous book. You have Marcus Brody in it throughout. You have Indy searching for the lost city of Z and Colonel Fawcett. You have plenty of peril. You have voodoo rituals. You have cannibalistic tribes trying to kill Indy. You have an entire lost city of inhabitants with special abilities, including the ability to exist in a dream state and turn themselves invisible. You have an entire, actually quite nice sequence on Sugarloaf Mountain in Rio de Janeiro. You have an entire action sequence on a plane that's really well done and is so well done you wish it was in one of the Indy films. You have so much pulpy flavor here that I think anyone will get some enjoyment out of reading this. But there are some elements of some of my issues with the first two books that do creep in here, and that does make it a little bit of a more difficult read than it should be. There are definite points where you're going to find yourself wanting to either take a break or to just kind of force yourself to keep going to get to the next chapter and get to the next little nugget of plot development. So you can tell that MacGregor is finding his way writing these, and he's getting better. But I do think there are still some issues here, and most especially the ending is my real sticking point. I think if this book didn't end the way that it does so abruptly, I would have a better opinion of it, because the ending is so abrupt and so underbaked that it does really get on your nerves. So I want to preface that for anyone who has not read this particular book and is reading these books for the first time. The book is quite enjoyable, but when you get to the ending, you're definitely gonna have a sort of knee-jerk reaction against it. So it does at least mark a point at which this sort of opening trilogy ends, and then in the next book we essentially start on a new chapter of the earlier days of Indiana Jones before the films. I did really enjoy coming back to Seven Veils. Again, this was the only Indiana Jones novel I had growing up, so it's the only one I've actually read more than once or read before, and this is the first time I'm actually reading these books in order, so it definitely makes a lot more sense now that I've read the previous two books, so I understand all the references it's making. However, you can read any of these as a standalone book, so I was able to do that, and I understood who Deirdre was and the references to Dance of the Giants, but it's helpful actually having read that book now. So those are my overall thoughts and opinions on rereading Indiana Jones and the Seven Veils, the third in the Bantam novels of Indiana Jones prequels. I think this is something every Indy fan should try out, is actually reading the Bantam books and seeing what you like in them. And of the initial books, Seven Veils is definitely the wildest, the most pulpy, and the most consistently adventure-driven. Just be prepared for the ending to go completely off the rails and go into essentially what feels like a completely different book. If you can handle that, if you can get on board with that, I think this is easily the best of the first three. But again, that's opinions vary wildly on these, especially these first three books. If you talk to Indy fans who have read the MacGregor novels, and specifically about the first three, everyone seems to have a different opinion on which of the first three is best and what they like and don't like in them. And Seven Veils is very divisive. So ironically, this was the only one I had as a kid and the first one I read, so I was very confused, let's put it that way. So I would definitely recommend reading Peril at Delphi and Dance of the Giants before jumping into Seven Veils. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed my babblings about The Man with the Hat, books, and book collecting. Please do keep supporting independent bookstores wherever possible. They need all your support, and unfortunately the Indy books are out of print again, so your best bet on finding them outside of eBay purchases is hunting your local bookshop and trying to find an artifact in the form of the Bantam Indiana Jones novels somewhere in the adventure section. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.